to continue reading from my book, The 1910s. Okay, let's go! Chapter 1, Reform and Reaction. The Progressive Movement Changes America. Richard Hofstadter. After 50 years of incredible economic growth and territorial expansion following the Civil War, the nation turned its gaze to unsolved problems which accompanied the rapid development. While some Americans accumulated enormous profit, others labored and lived in squalor. Government had become too closely allied with the interests of big business, and individual rights suffered. To rectify these and other problems, the Progressive Movement appeared. Acclaimed historian and reform movement Richard Hofstadter explains the origin of the Progressive Movement in this introduction to a book about the era. I don't know why I said it like that. I'm stupid. For a long time, historians have written of the period roughly between 1900 and 1914 as Progressive era, and of its variety of reform agitations as a Progressive Movement. And these designations, the historians have followed the example of many of the period's leading figures who liked the ring of the word progressive as it applied to themselves. The men of that age were proudly aware, even as they were fighting their battles, that there was something distinctive about the political and social life of their time, which sharply marked it off from the preceding era of materialism and corruption. The need for change. From the end of the Civil War to the close of the 19th century, the physical energies of the American people had been mobilized for a remarkable burst of material development, but their more energies had lain relatively dormant. Certain moral facets of the American character had become all but invisible. It was as though the controversy over slavery, the Civil War itself, and the difficulties and failures of Reconstruction had exhausted the moral and political capacities of the people and left them relieved to abandon crusades and reforms and to plunge instead into the rewarding tasks of material achievement. During this period, American settlers and entrepreneurs have filled up a vast area of land between the Mississippi River and California and has spanned the country with a railroad network of more than 250,000 miles. The number of farms as well as the number of acres under cultivation doubled between 1870 and 1900, and the production of wheat, cotton, and corn had increased from 2 to 2.5 times. Still more impressive was the growth of the urban and industrial segment of the economy. Whole systems of industry and whole regions of industrial production were created. Between 1870 and 1900, the production of bituminous coal increased 5 times, of crude petroleum 12 times, of steel ingots and castings more than 140 times. The urban population jumped from 9.9 million to 30.1 million, and thoughtful observers could see that the day was not very far off when the rural population would be outnumbered and the characteristic problems of the nation would be city problems. The larger cities grew to an almost alarming speed, and the pace of their growth seemed to outstrip their means of administration. Chicago, for example, more than doubled its population in a single decade, 1880 to 1890, and the growth rate for that decade alone of from 60 to 80% was not uncommon for the newer cities of the Middle West. Whatever. Toward the turn of the century, it became increasingly evident that all this material growth had been achieved at a terrible cost in human values and the waste of natural resources. The land and the people had both been plundered. The farmers whose products had not only fed the expanding national working force, but had also paid abroad for much of the foreign capital that financed American industrialization, had received pathetic returns for the toil. They had little or no protection against exploitation by the railroads, against the high cost of credit, or against an unjust burden of taxation. At the same time, the cities that grew with American industry were themselves industrial wastelands. Centers of vice and poverty, ugly full of crowded slums, badly administered. Industry, after a period of hectic competition, was rapidly becoming concentrated, a process which was hastened by the power of finance capital. Big business took free competition and concentrated political power in a few hands. Stirred by such works as Ida Tarbell's account of the methods of the Standard Oil Company, men began to realize how ruthless were the methods by which some great enterprises and great fortunes had been built, how business competitors and industrial workers alike had been exploited by the captives of industry. Moreover, business, great and small, had debased politics, working with powerful bosses in city, state, and nation. It had won favors and privileges in return for the subsidies to corrupt machines. Domination of affairs by political bosses and business organizations was now seen to be a threat to democracy itself. What happened, as a great many men of goodwill saw at the beginning of the Progressive Era, was that in the extraordinary outburst of productive energy of the last few decades, the nation had not developed any corresponding degree the means of meeting human nature, controlling or reforming the manifold evils that come with any such rapid physical change. The progressive movement then may be looked upon as an attempt to develop the moral will, the intellectual insight, and the political and administrative agencies to remedy the accumulated evils and negligence of a period of industrial growth. Since the progressives were not revolutionists, it was also an attempt to work out a strategy for orderly social change. A broad umbrella. Of course, not everyone looked at the evils that burned the society from their great point of view, and it would be a mistake to exaggerate the measure of agreement among those who were called or chose to call themselves progressives. The larger the numbers, the more likely serious differences among them would be, and in a short time their numbers became large indeed. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the progressive movement was that it became so pervasive that so many people could at some time and on some issue be called progressive. In the three-corner presidential election of 1912, the two most popular candidates, Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, you could both read about their wives, and you could read about both of their wives. You could listen to and or read along. You could listen to both of their wives in one of my videos called The Secret Lives of the First Ladies. Okay, so let's continue. Both ran on progressive platforms and made progressive sounding speeches, and between them they had almost 70% of the popular votes. Even the third candidate, President Taft, who had offended the progressives in his own party and was inevitably cast in the conservative role, had been identified with some progressive issues. Significantly, his party's leaders thought it wise to declare in their platform that they were prepared to go forward with the solution of those new questions which social, economic, and political development had brought to the forefront of the nation's interests, and to promise to satisfy the just demands of the people for the study and solution of the complex and constantly treated problems of social welfare. Thus, even the conservatism of 1912 thought it would be to its advantage to present itself as being, in some degree, progressive. When a term becomes as widely adopted as this, we may justifiably be suspicious of the precision of its meaning. To speak of any two men in this era as being progressives in their general political direction does not mean that they will be in agreement on all social or political issues. One cannot forget the great heterogeneity of the country, or ignore the possibility that progressivism could mean something different in the countryside from what it meant in the city that might have different principles in the northeast as opposed to the south and west. That businessmen who favor some progressive measures might have different hopes from those of professional and middle class progressives, and that progressives in the farm country would have some special interests of their own. It is necessary also to bear in mind the variety of issues about which one might or might not have taken a progressive point of view. Trusts and finance, capital bosses and public control of politics, taxation and tariffs, conservation, railroad rates and debates, vice and corruption, the conditions of labor and the role of labor unions, women's suffrage, the rights of Negroes, referendum and recall, city reform, even prohibition. The diversity of these issues and the diversity of social classes and social interests that were at play in the political system multiplies the possibilities for disagreement within the progressive movement. A businessman and a labor leader might have common notions about a campaign against corruption, but have diametrically opposed ideas about the position of trade unions. A small town banker and a farmer might see eye to eye on certain matters of financial reform, but have wholly different views on the referendum and recall. Two harassed shippers might agree heartily on the necessity of doing something about railroad rates, but fall out over tariff policy. No doubt there were at work in the progressive movement some persons who deserved the generic label of reformers for having given enthusiastic support to most of the proposals for change that are being agitated in their day. But there were also one interest and one issue of people who worked arduously to advance this or that reform and remain quite indifferent to the others. Historians have rightly refused to allow such complications to prevent them from speaking of the progressive movement and the progressive era. It is a historian's business not only to take careful account of particulars, but also to set the general direction of social movements in the past. For all its internal differences and countercurrents there were in progressivism, certain general tendencies, certain widespread commitments of belief which outweigh the particulars. It is this commitments and beliefs which make it possible to use the term progressive in the hope that the unity it conveys will not be misconstrued. Progressivism's unique qualities. What were these distinguishing qualities that mark progressivism? The name itself might be slightly misleading here. Of course, progressives believed in progress, but so did a great many conservatives who argued that they had a sounder understanding of how progress works and of the pace at which it goes on. The distinguishing thing about the progressives was something else, which, for lack of a better term, might be called activism. They argued that social evils will not remedy themselves, and that it is wrong to sit by passively and wait for time to take care of them. As Herbert Croly put it, they did not believe that the future would take care of itself. They believed that the people of the country should be stimulated to work energetically to bring about social progress, and the positive powers of government must be used to achieve this end. Conservatives generally believed in time and nature to bring progress. Progressives believed in energy and governmental action. The basic mood of progressivism was intensely optimistic. One can, to be sure, find in the writing of some progressive note of anxiety as to what might happen to the country if various proposed reforms failed to relieve the most threatening evils. Some of them feared that a continued concentration of power in the hands of investment banking firms, which they called the money trust, might in the long run undermine American democracy in the spirit of enterprise. But the dominant note is one of confidence, of faith that no problem is too difficult to be overcome by the proper mobilization of energy and intelligence and sincerity. And when one thinks of the outstanding political leaders of the progressive era, men like Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, William Jennings Bryan, and Robert M. La Follette, one thinks mainly of men with a certain faith serene, malicious, or buoyant in the possibilities of the future. The movement was animated with the sense that something new and hopeful was being created, with a faith that found itself embodied in party slogans or the titles of important books. The old order changes. The new democracy, the new freedom, the new nationalism, the promise of American life. This promise of social progress is not to be realized by sitting and praying, but by using the active powers, by the exposure of evils through the spreading of information and the exhortation of the century, by using the possibilities inherent in the ballot to find new and vigorous popular leaders, in short, by revivification of democracy. Politicians and thinkers join hands. Progressivism was largely the creation of a new and younger generation of politicians who had come of age after the problems of Reconstruction had been largely settled, who had grown up along with post-Civil War industrialization, who had never acquiesced in the crass and ruthless materialism of its captors of industry. These politicians were very often of well-established families, the sons of well-to-do professionals or businessmen, who were inspired by the high civic ideals kept alive since the Civil War by the Mugwump reformers. They saw that their own political careers were not to be made by catering to moneymakers, but by some more disinterested contribution either in the reform of industrial political evils or in the promotion of America's interests in the arena of world politics, or as in the case of Theodore Roosevelt, by both. Hence the progressive movement was led by young men. In 1900, Robert M. La Follette was 45. Woodrow Wilson and Louis D. Brandeis were 44. Roosevelt 42. Bryant 40. Albert Beveridge and Hughes the Borat 35. Hiram Johnson 34. Joseph W. Folk 31. The writers who did so much to shape the tone of the period were even younger. For Ida L. Tarbell was 43 in 1900. Herbert Crawley 35. Lincoln Steffens 34. David Graham Phillips 33. Ray Stannard 30. Walter Weil 27. And Upton Sinclair only 22. What politics are doing in the field of public leadership, and what writers are doing in the field of reporting exposure a new generation of thinkers and scholars doing in the academic world. Men like Charles A. Beard and J. Allen Smith in history, political science, Richard T. Ely, John R. Commerce, and Adolphus Thorstein Veblen in economics, John Dewey in philosophy and education, Lester F. Ward, Edward A. Ross, and Charles H. Cooley in sociology, and the admirers of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. and jurisprudence were together developed a kind of social criticism that transcended the formalistic doctrines and methods of their predecessors and tried to cope with the sordid and often unacknowledged realities of the world. Men such as these were concerned not so much with formal political philosophies and the texts of constitutions as with the interest behind them, not so much with old-fashioned economic doctrine as with the actual development of economic institutions, not so much with the elaboration of philosophical or educational systems with the progressive use of thought and action, not so much with the preaching of high social principles as with the development of detailed knowledge of the operation of social forces, not so much with elaboration of legal tradition as with the way in which legal decisions were actually arrived at. New political writers emerged like Herbert Croly, the founder of the New Republic, and his colleagues Walter Lippmann and Walter Weil, who used the newer thought to analyze for a broad public the problems of the writing of the progressive, sometimes sympathetically and sometimes in a spirit of keen criticism. Hardly less important than the work of academic and journalistic critics was the influence of social Christianity. For some time, large segments of the Protestant clergy had been alarmed at the violence of labor conflict, appalled at city living conditions and troubled by the failure of the churches to win an adequate following among urban workers. During the 1890s, the clerical conviction that Christianity to make a contribution to solve the new moral problems of industrialism must become a social force as well as a religious creed. It precipitated a strong movement to make the churches socially effective. The writing of such leaders as the social gospel as Washington Gladden and Walter Rauschenbusch helped to give the progressive movement the character of evangelical revival in politics and economics. In the progressive protest, the voice of the Christian conscience was heard more clearly than at any time since the days of the abolitionist movement. Another notable feature of the era was the increasing role of women in American politics. Women had, of course, long been interested in reform movements and had played a prominent part in abolitionism. But the numbers of women active in political affairs had been very limited. Now the educated middle-class woman was beginning to grow tired of the passivity that was expected of her and sought to express herself in civic affairs. Her own interests as a mother were brought into play by her concern over the education and welfare of her children in the urban environment in which they lived and such municipal facilities as playgrounds, schools, and parks. Her interests as a consumer were alerted by political struggles over tariffs, taxes, monopolies, and graft. But more importantly, her interests were her sympathies, for she was shocked by the revaluations that were being made almost every day about the conditions of labor, women, and children in the mills and urban poor lived in the mines of the country, of the conditions in which the urban poor lived in the tenement house district. Women were beginning to develop their own heroes of philanthropic action, like Jane Addams, the founder of the famous social settlement at Hull House in Chicago, and also to feel more strongly about their political rights, believing that they were far better equipped than men to introduce into politics the noble morality and humane concern that the state of American society needs so badly. Women in increasing numbers began to demand the vote for themselves. By 1940, they had to vote in 11 states, and their efforts were crowned with final success in the 19th Amendment, which was ratified in 1920. Please comment, rate, and subscribe down below. And if you're on YouTube, please ring that bell notification so that you can know when I upload next, because I'm kind of very busy right now. So anyways, now if you're on TikTok, please like and follow my videos. On YouTube, let's get to 50 subscribers. And on TikTok, let's get to 50 followers. Because once you do that for both, then I'm going to do something fun. I'm not going to tell you because we need to get there, okay? I might be reading a special book that's near and dear to my heart or something. Okay? So, yeah, and if you want to, you can buy something on my eBay and or Mercari. Okay? Bye.